Hey everyone, I'm on the road right now, so this might sound a little different to your ears than normal, but I wanted to share with you an episode of the podcast from way back in 2014, in which I sat down with the legendary international relations scholar Joseph Nye. He passed away on May 7th at the age of 88. He's best known, of course, for developing and advancing the idea of soft power, the ability to influence others and shape outcomes through attraction, persuasion, and cultural or ideological appeal rather than coercion or force. I actually had the opportunity to interview Joseph Nye twice for the podcast. Most recently, we sat down in person at the Aspen Security Forum a couple of years ago to discuss China's unique and somewhat flailing attempt at wielding soft power. You can find that episode in the archives. Today, though, I wanted to go deep into the archives and share this conversation from way back in 2014. At the time, the Global Dispatches podcast was a little different in tone and style than it is today, and really, in 2014, no one quite knew what a podcast was. I had essentially modeled the first 200 or so episodes on a podcast called WTF with Mark Maron, which featured in-depth interviews with people in the entertainment and comedy communities who would discuss their lives and career. I'm not particularly funny and don't know much about the entertainment industry, but I do have a passion and background in international relations and foreign policy, so I somewhat co-opted the interview style and applied it to journalists, academics, diplomats, and other famous and not-so-famous figures in international affairs. Needless to say, I was thrilled to have the opportunity to conduct a long-form interview with Joseph Nye, someone who, as anyone who knew him could attest, was always generous with his time. We began our conversation talking about Russia's then recent annexation of Crimea and occupation of parts of eastern Ukraine, and what that suggested about long-held ideas in international relations theory. We then pivot to his personal story, including his childhood in New Jersey and how his entry into the world of international relations was as an Africanist. He wrote an award-winning thesis as a Rhodes Scholar on decolonization in East Africa. Of course, we also discussed at length how he came up with the idea of soft power, which, as he explains, stemmed from an aha moment while sitting in his kitchen. We are all lucky to have lived in the same time as Joseph Nye, and I'm particularly grateful to have had the opportunity to interview him twice. I am now very happy to share that original interview with you now. Rest in soft power, Dr. Nye. Welcome to Global Dispatches. This is your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. Great show today. Joseph Nye is on the line. You probably know him for his theory of soft power, and he has had a long and distinguished and fascinating career in international relations, both as an academic and inside policy-making circles. And we discuss it all. One thing that surprised me about this conversation is where he got his start. Now, we typically, these days, by we, I mean those of us who are nerdy international relations enthusiasts, know Joseph Nye as a grand international relations theorist who advances theories around what we call neoliberalism. But in the 1960s, he got his start as an Africanist. He studied the politics of East Africa, and that launched his career into the grand international relations theorist that we know him today. We kick off with a brief discussion about the ways in which Putin's actions in Eastern Europe affirm, challenge, or undermine currently held theories of international relations. So it starts a little heady, but then we get into the more granular and fun details of Dr. Nye's life and career. Here it is, my conversation with Professor Joseph Nye.
Well, I don't think it's challenged any of my basic approaches, but I think what it has challenged has been the expectation of how strongly the norms of non-intervention or not changing territorial boundaries and possession by force. I think many people felt that norm was pretty firmly established in Europe in the recent years, and that taking Crimea by force was more of a challenge than I think many people expected. So it's not unheard of in international politics for things like this to happen. I think there was a feeling that the norms had been fairly well established in Europe in recent decades, and that that was something of surprise. So notice that Putin did something similar in Georgia in 2008. So it's Russia is a declining country, and Putin has been risk acceptant, willing to take high risks, and I think that it's not a challenge to our understanding of international politics. Countries do things like this. I think his acceptance of risk and the price he's willing to pay, I think, is probably surprised some people.
Do you, I guess, consider the violation of this norm to be sort of like a one-off thing that is just Putin, acting as declining powers do, or do you see this as potentially auguring something more, consequential over the long term?
Well, I think some people think that Putin is interested in developing a coalition of states that might be called revisionist powers, not willing to live with the status quo. And so some people think, well, this will spread. I mean, that China will try to take more of the South China Sea or the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands from Japan, or and others that Putin will work with Xi Jinping to create this coalition of the revisionist powers to overcome the post-1945 settlement. I think that's too dramatic. I don't think that's likely to happen. I think the Chinese have interests in the current framework of international politics, from which they've done very well. I'm not sure they want to overthrow that. So I don't think the Chinese are as revisionist in their attitudes toward the international norms and institutions as the Russians have been. So in that sense, I don't see it. I mean, whether Putin himself may go further in terms of trying to take more of Ukraine, it's possible. On the other hand, I think it can be made expensive for him. And he may not do it, but on the idea of his organizing a coalition of revisionist powers to overthrow the kind of system that was created after 1945, I don't think that's likely, or I don't think he will succeed in that.
And if you were, in the Oval Office, which I'm sure you have been, well, and we'll obviously get into that a little later in the interview, how would you advise President Obama to, deal with this, the current situation in a way that, ensures, long-term stability of the international system, and an international system that's, by far, benefited, the United States over the last 50 years.
I think by and large he's acted appropriately, which was to avoid grandstanding and to prevent Putin from dividing the U.S. from the Europeans. So in this sense that Obama has kept in very close contact with Merkel, with sort of constant phone calls, letting Merkel often take the lead, and continuing to push towards somewhat firmer sanctions, which they now got after the NATO meeting in Wales. As one European leader put it to me in a conversation, Obama doesn't get enough credit for his success in bringing the Europeans along and preventing Putin from driving a wedge between the U.S. and Europe. And that if Obama had been more flamboyant or bombastic, or played to his domestic opinion in the United States, as some American senators have wanted, he would not have been so successful in bringing the Europeans along. on issues of sanctions and so forth. Since we don't have a military option in Ukraine, we have a military option in the sense of reinforcing deterrence in Article 5 for NATO countries, but Ukraine is not a NATO country. And since Putin has escalation dominance in the local military sense in Ukraine, as he did in Georgia in 2008, I think Obama has to then play on diplomacy and sanctions as his ways of trying to put pressure on Russia to deter or limit its behavior. And by and large, that works if you're able to maintain a coalition and hold it together. And so far, Obama seems to have been able to do this. So I actually, as it happens, I was in the White House visiting a friend last week, and essentially what I said was that I thought the general strategy was about right. And that I published this in my column for Project Syndicate, a diplomatic strategy for dealing with a declining Russia, which says, angry as we may be with the Russians, we have to figure out how do you reconcile the need to deter them with a certain number of sticks, if you want, but also to negotiate with them in the areas where we have common interests. And working that out as a strategy is quite difficult. So far, I think they've done it reasonably well.
Who is your friend that you're visiting?
Well, I don't think I should name.
Is that can't name names? No, understood. But I suppose that we listeners just kind of got a snippet of what you were discussing with your friend in the White House. So it was a prescient question, I think. So turning gears a little bit, where are you from? Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in northern New Jersey.
It's the hotbed of all international relations theory.
Right. And my father worked in New York, but we lived out.
What did your father do?
He was in Wall Street, and
Okay.
he was a stockbroker. And he would commute in on the train from western New Jersey, where we lived on a farm there. And so I grew up actually in spending a lot of my time working and playing on this.
What kind of farm? What kind of farm was it?
Well, we had a couple of cows, probably half a dozen pigs, a horse, several hundred chickens. It wasn't a commercial farm; it was a farm for our use, feeding the family and so forth. But it was a different kind of life than growing up playing Little League baseball or other things that were more normal suburban kids.
And I guess, what was your first exposure to the world at large? Like, was there a book that you read or a news article that sparked your interest that inspired some curiosity in you from at an early age?
Well, I think I first went to Europe on a trip with my parents when I was 16, and that.
About what year was this?
This would be in the 1950s, and obviously I was interested in Europe as a result of that. But I think that probably the thing that had the most impact on what I wound up choosing to do in life was when I went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, and I was in a college where I met a man from Ghana, and we used to sit and argue late into the night about whether Africa was creating a new form of democracy and how an independent Africa was going to be different. And it was intriguing and exciting stuff. And that made me feel, well,
What
I want
what
I want to
became of
go and
your?
visit Africa. Well, he went back to Ghana, but I went back to the United States and to do a PhD at Harvard. And I said, rather than doing my thesis research and sitting in Widener Library, I would rather go out in Africa and interview people. And so I got a grant from the Ford Foundation, and I went and spent a year and a half in East Africa, in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, doing a study of the East African common market and whether that could be preserved. So
About what year was this?
this would have been 62 through 64,
Mm-hmm.
which gave me the rare opportunity to watch two countries become independent. I went to the independence ceremony for Uganda in 62, and then the independence ceremony for Kenya at the end of 63. And I've always felt that was a rare treat to watch two countries become independent.
And what was your theory about the common market? What were you studying?
I had been taking a seminar on economic development at Harvard as a graduate student, which was taught by John Kenneth Galbraith and Edward Mason. Mason had just come back from chairing a World Bank mission to Uganda, and he said, one of the hard things to figure out is when we plan for Uganda, should we plan for a market of, as it then was, about 10 million, or should we plan for a market of about 35 million, which would be if they preserve the East African common market? He said, this job is too hard for an economist. And he said, some political scientist ought to figure that out. I thought, well, that's a thesis topic. So I looked at the literature on common markets, regional integration, and theories of how it would grow. Much of it was influenced by Europe at the time. And I tried to find out what were the prospects for the common market in East Africa, and in a way that was beneficial to my academic career, I wrote a book that said it's not likely to succeed, though I felt badly about it because for the sake of the East Africans, I wanted it to succeed. But the prediction turned out to be correct. And it's interesting that now they're making efforts to reconstitute that common market, nearly a half century later.
I mean, do you think it fell because, I mean, those three countries, experienced, a lot of hope and optimism in the 60s, and then, by the 70s were kind of overrun, I guess, by Idi Amin in Uganda, and then was it probably Moi by then I guess it was before Moi in
but
Kenya.
The collapse was earlier. It was well before Amin, and it ironically it was more structural in the sense rather than the individuals. You had leaders like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania who were committed to Pan-Africanism and escaping the colonial prisons as they saw it from the states that had been drawn by statesmen in Europe in the 19th century. And they said, we're all Africans, we can overcome this. But in fact, they couldn't. Ironically, the machinery that they had captured in their independence movements, the machinery of the state, whether it be Kenya or Uganda or Tanzania, was the machinery they needed to try to build their new nations. And so they couldn't give up those tools because those are the only tools they had. So the title of my thesis was Pan-Africanism and East African Federation. And the question is, if you had leaders of goodwill who talked about a broader vision, but had to use the instruments of the states that they had inherited in responding to demands from below of people who wanted to see concrete improvements of their life, could they create something wider and broader or not? And the answer was not.
So You wrote this thesis. How was it received, and how did it? Where did you go from there?
Well, it won a prize, fortunately, at Harvard, and it was published by Harvard University Press. And it made me interested in the question of, well, if the problems are structural, it's very hard to create a common market among less developed countries, particularly in a post-colonial situation. Can you generalize that? And as it turned out, there was a common market among less developed countries that was succeeding at the time, which was the Central American common market. And so I thought, well, I should test my theory by looking at this case that looks like an anomalous case, that looks like it's succeeding where I had said the structural problems made it difficult to succeed. So I went and spent 6 months in Central America doing a study of the Central American common market, basically saying, why is this different? In what ways is different? And then after that, I went and did a study in Europe of the European common market, and eventually wrote a book that called Peace in Parts about regional integration. What are the prospects for developing coherent, integrated regions around the world? And that book was published in the early 70s, and I think it still holds up pretty well.
And all the time you were researching, you were teaching at Harvard. When was your first foray into public service, into working for the government?
That would have come in 1977, and when I was invited to join the Carter administration, and that grew out of work that I'd done when I was looking at the politics of common markets and of markets generally. Among the type of trade that was then regarded as very dangerous and difficult was trade in nuclear materials. And that got me interested in what kinds of controls could be created to restrict the flows of plutonium and enriched uranium. And that got me into the area of nonproliferation. And Cyrus Vance, who was the Secretary of State, who I'd met at various meetings in which the issues of proliferation were being discussed, asked me if I would come and handle this proliferation issue for the Carter administration, and I said yes, and it was a very exciting 2-year leave from Harvard from 77 to 79.
And what sort of controls did you find would be effective?
Well, we established, I signed was the American representative to the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which is a group of countries that had advanced technology on nuclear weapons, where there was an agreement that suppliers would exercise restraint in their export of these technologies to other countries. So in 75, 76, France had agreed to sell a reprocessing plant to Pakistan. Germany had agreed to sell an enrichment plant to Brazil. And when Carter first came in, we were able to get those situations turned around. And then to get a general agreement on how to restrain the export of sensitive technologies so that the Non-Proliferation Treaty wouldn't have a hole in it. That now we're still debating that to this day, but some of the issues related to Iran today are difficult in those terms. But
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just going to say, but the efforts that were made in the Carter administration, I think, did put some backbone into American nonproliferation efforts that were important.
And what did you learn about international relations through this experience? Through, for example, getting a country like France to, withhold supplying a, nuclear material to Pakistan, I think was the example you gave.
Well, it's a you realize that sometimes what you read in the papers and what you see in the press don't coincide with what you see. For example, when we persuaded, I remember negotiating this, so it was first-hand experience. When we persuaded the French to not continue the final steps of the reprocessing plant, much of which had already been built. The answer we got was, we will stop, we'll tell the Pakistanis not that it's canceled, but that there's a delay. But if you ever say that this was an agreement with you that led to its cancellation, then we'll repudiate that and we'll go ahead and finish it. And I thought, well, that's tough, but we were able to keep it quiet, and the French were willing to go through their deal, and they never delivered the so-called front end of the reprocessing plant.
Well, I hope now that you've divulged the big secret, they haven't.
Well, actually,
they won't go ahead.
It's divulged in the first chapter or of my book on the future of power. I tell this story, it's now long enough ago that there are no problems, as a way to show that it's not always a case of, power isn't always a case of hard power, of threatening or coercing another country. We had no way to coerce the French. We didn't say to them, we'll cut off martial aid. There was no martial aid at this stage. We had to do it by attraction and persuasion. And so I use this example to show that the sort of the mechanical views that, you get another country to change its position by doing it all with sticks and carrots no, sometimes you do it with attraction and persuasion.
Well, and I absolutely want to get into a discussion of soft power, but I just want to sort of get back to our timeline a little bit. So you were in the Carter administration for 2 years. How did you spend the Reagan years?
Well, I was back at Harvard, and one of the things that was interesting was having worked intensely for 2 years on nuclear issues inside the government. I remember thinking to myself, if I get back to university, I want to spend some time trying to think about the larger question, and particularly some of the ethical questions concerned with nuclear issues. And so I taught seminars about that and published a book in the mid-'80s called Nuclear Ethics, or How Do You Think About What's Right and Wrong When You're Dealing with Nuclear Weapons. And so I did a fair amount of work on nuclear issues, arms control issues, and in the 80s.
Did you ever find an ethical, a persuasive ethical argument for how a retaliatory nuclear strike might, in some ways, be ethically okay?
I thought it was pretty hard to justify a nuclear strike, but there's a difference between actually using it and threatening it.
Right.
And which is what deterrence is based on. So a lot of the book was, can you intend something, and what does it mean to intend it if it has certain consequences? And my position came out not very far from that taken by the American Catholic bishops, who did a pastoral letter on this, written by my friend Brian Hare. I'm not Catholic, but I thought the reasoning that went into just war theory, which was the framework which they used, made good sense. And I would say there was a strong similarity between the framework I developed in nuclear ethics and their reasoning.
And so Bill Clinton comes to office. You've obviously previously aligned yourself with a Democrat. So how did you come to work in the Clinton administration?
Well, in the Clinton administration, I was asked at one stage at the beginning, whether I wanted to go into the Pentagon by Les Aspin. But Jim Woolsey, who was then becoming the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, asked me if I would come and chair the National Intelligence Council, which does intelligence estimates for the president. And it was a hard choice, but the idea of having a chance to look at everything as chairing the National Intelligence Council prevailed, and so I spent a year and a half running the National Intelligence Council, and then after Les Aspin left the Pentagon, uh, his deputy Bill Perry became Secretary of Defense, and he said, "Well, would you be willing to change your mind and come to the Pentagon?" And I thought, well, I've had a wonderful experience in what's it like to pretend you're omniscient, which you can do in intelligence, but you can't put your hand on the policy levers. Suppose I succumb not to the vice of omniscience, but to the vice of omnipotence, or the temptation of omnipotence, and try to put my hand on the policy lever by becoming Assistant Secretary of Defense. So I did, and I spent another year and a half at the Defense Department, and also enjoyed that very much. But you have time to think when you're in intelligence. You don't have time to think, but you can actually act on policy when you're in defense.
At the National Intelligence Council, I mean, how much of your initial assessments, I suppose it's probably 1993, 1994-ish, focus on the crisis in the Balkans?
A lot of time on the Balkans, and in fact, if someday when these things are declassified, and actually goes back to the period before I came, so I don't necessarily get the credit, the National Intelligence Council and the Intelligence Committee were pretty good on what was going to happen to Yugoslavia. I mean, good in the sense that they predicted correctly, bad in the sense that it was a bad outcome. But where people always say about intelligence failures, this was not an intelligence failure. But I think more interesting in that period was that we did some intelligence estimates that were ahead of the game. For example, we did one on the dangers of biological warfare and the fact that people at that time were not realizing that biological terrorism could become a serious issue. And so after 9/11, when you had the anthrax episode, we had already, 8 years earlier, had an internal document, very highly classified, about the dangers of biological terrorism. And we also did an estimate, for example, on the rise of China. When people were saying, what should we do about China, how much of a threat will it be? I think it was in 94, we did an estimate saying, here are 8 different scenarios of how China might behave and which ones would be dangerous for us and which ones not so. So, I mean, some of those estimates I found were really quite interesting and a chance to try to look ahead.
I know we just have a few minutes left. I did want to ask you about the roots of, or the intellectual roots, or how you sort of came to the idea of soft power. I remember reading the book. I suppose it probably came out in about 2003 or 2004.
Well, the book on soft power, as such, was 2004.
But you had written about it.
2003. But I first wrote about it first invented the concept in 1989 for the book that I published in 1990. Called Bound to Lead. And at that time, there was a conventional wisdom that the United States was in decline. And Paul Kennedy's book, my friend Paul Kennedy, had a bestseller with the rise and fall of great powers. I didn't agree with them, and I thought the United States was not in decline. I thought this was cyclical. And so I looked at American military power, and I looked at American economic power, and I said, there's still something else that provides power, which I'm not catching with this assessment, and that's that ability to get others to want what you want, not just to coerce them or pay them. And that's how I developed the concept of soft power. So that the original publication of soft power as an idea was in 1990, but then after the invasion of Iraq, I felt that we were making such a mess of our soft power that I thought maybe I should write a book just about soft power. And that's the book. It's called Soft Power.
Which I've read as a great standalone book for any student of international relations. Was there like a specific aha moment on soft power? you're walking through the park in Harvard Square or something, and
No,
the
it
Isaac
was more
Newton sort of thing.
sitting at my kitchen table. These are the days where I often wrote in longhand at that stage. I mean, I had a computer, but oddly enough, it was easier sometimes to work out ideas on longhand. And I remember writing at the kitchen table, trying to think through this idea: what's this other dimension of power which is not properly caught by military and economic power? And I remember thinking, here's what it looks like, and I think, well, why not call it soft power? So that was the aha moment. But this general issue of is the United States in decline, I've kept with that issue, and I just sent off to Polity Press in England a short manuscript called "Is the American Century Over?" and which will come out next March. And the short answer to that is no, but it's not going to look at all like it did when Henry Luce proclaimed it in 1941. So the topic of that originated of the book Bound to Lead, where the soft power concept originated, that topic of what's the future of American power has stuck with me, and it's still an interest that I'm trying to wrestle with.
I mean, if you have another minute or two, we should plug your forthcoming book if you'd like, and just kind of outline a couple of the ideas or themes. If not, we can end it here.
Well, in brief, the somebody coming in. The gist of it is that to use a phrase that I use in the book, hegemony ain't what it used to be, but then it never was. That there's always been there's always been an exaggeration of the extent to which the Americans had control. But in an age where you have not just a transition of power, but a diffusion of power from states to non-state actors, it may be that instead of focusing so much of our efforts on the rise of another state, I don't think China's going to replace us, for example. We should ask ourselves, what about entropy or decay? In other words, the diffusion of power to non-state actors and the difficulty of maintaining leadership when you have diffusion of power. And that, to me, is the bigger problem or bigger challenge than just the rise of China.
I could spend all day talking to you about this, but I thank you so much for your time, for your contributions to how I understand international relations in the world, and I think how many of my listeners do as well. So, Dr. Nye, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
And thank you all for listening. Remember, you can subscribe to Global Dispatches on iTunes, and I suggest you do. And I suggest you take a look at the archives. I now have about 33 or 34 of these long-form interviews with foreign policy newsmakers and luminaries that I think are, kind of taken together, provide a pretty good oral history project about U.S. foreign policy of the last half of last century and the first 10th of this century. So stay tuned for another episode coming up soon, and we'll see you later. Bye.
Well, thank you again to Dr. Nye. Rest in peace. My condolences to all who knew and loved him. That episode I decided to take out from behind the paywall for all the obvious reasons. But, as I said at the end of that interview, there are dozens of interviews like that with various luminaries in foreign policy that are deep in the archives that you can access by becoming a paid subscriber at globaldispatches.org. For now, though, let's just think and remember Joseph Nye. And thank you, Dr. Nye, for contributing to my understanding of the world.